What would you do if, in the middle of a lavish party, a maid ripped a painting off the wall, and behind it was a child hiding, thin, dirty, and trembling? The child had been there for days without food or water, and the first thing she said when the maid found her was, "It's been 5 days here without water. I thought no one would ever find me." That's exactly what happened that night. And when the guests screamed, the millionaire simply fell to his knees upon recognizing who it was. "Waity, before we delve into this amazing story, tell me which city and state you're watching from. Leave a comment and I'll reply with gratitude. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and like this video. We want to share more stories like this. The deceptive quiet of that mansion began long before the party started, as if each wall carried a kind of uncomfortable silence, the kind that seems to observe everything, that whispers stories no one dares to tell. The stepmother walked through the corridors in her impeccable dress, dragging the fabric as if she owned not only the house, but also every breath that happened within. And while she gave orders, arranged flowers, and checked details, the girl, the millionaire's only daughter, disappeared from everyone's thoughts except for the maid, who missed that shy presence, that look that always seemed to ask for help without having the courage to truly ask. The father, busy with the party preparations, believed the stepmother's excuse. The girl would be on a school trip for a few days. He didn't even notice that he hadn't heard his daughter's voice that morning, nor did he find it strange that her room was cold, too tidy, too quiet. The self-assured stepmother insisted on repeating that the children needed new experiences, that the girl would be happy to travel, even though the child herself had said, in a whisper, that she didn't want to go. The maid, however, knew that house like no one else. She knew every routine, every corner, every change in the mood among the residents. And she also knew that look in the stepmother's eyes, the look of someone who sees a child as an obstacle, not as life. Therefore, when she realized that hours had passed since she'd seen the girl, she felt a discomfort in her chest, as if something was too wrong, too intense to be a coincidence. She remembered the times she'd seen the stepmother pressuring the girl to eat alone in the corner of the kitchen, the harsh words whispered in deserted hallways, the glances that quickly crossed when the child dropped a glass of water, always followed by muffled insults. That was a secret of the house, a secret the father never saw. He believed he had found a refined, elegant, and loving woman, incapable of any malice. But the walls of that mansion knew the truth, and that day they were about to reveal everything. While the hall was being decorated with expensive arrangements, lit chandeliers, and food being carried back and forth, the maid passed twice by the enormous gilded painting in the living room, an old, heavy painting that the stepmother always told her not to clean too much. The stepmother herself was constantly rearranging that painting, saying it needed to be perfectly straight, aligned, and centered. The maid found it strange, but said nothing. But that afternoon, there was a detail that caught her attention. When she passed by the painting, she heard a sound so short that anyone else would have ignored it. It wasn't wind. It wasn't the vibration of the music they were testing in the hall. It was something like a sigh, but low, muffled, as if coming from inside the wall. She stopped, took 2 steps back, put her ear to it. Nothing, or perhaps something. A faint tapping, a tremor. She called out to someone, but when one of the waiters passed by, he laughed and said the mansion was old and noisy. The stepmother, seeing the maid standing before the painting, frowned and ordered her to go help in the kitchen. And it was at that moment that the maid realized how tense that woman became whenever someone got too close to that painting. Hours passed. Guests began to arrive. Soft music filled the hallways. The scent of expensive perfume mingled with that of sophisticated food. The millionaire circulated with a proud smile, believing he was having a perfect night. The stepmother greeted each guest as if she owned a kingdom. The girl's absence, silently swallowed by the lie of the excursion, seemed not to bother anyone. But the maid couldn't relax. There was a tightness in her chest, a calling she couldn't ignore. At a certain point, when the crowd moved to the main hall, she returned alone to the living room. The painting was there, imposing, heavy, gleaming under the chandeliers. And then it happened. A sound, now clearer, more distinct, something like a low cough. The maid turned her face away immediately, her heart racing. She approached slowly, as if entering forbidden territory. She placed her hand on the cold frame. She touched it, and she heard it. A muffled cry, small, weak, almost a cry for help. Fear gripped her, but it wasn't fear of what she would find. It was fear of discovering the truth too late. She called softly, "Is anyone there?" And then the world seemed to stop when a hoarse, childlike voice answered, "Water!" The maid felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Instinct took over. Without thinking, she gripped the frame tightly. The picture was heavy, but adrenaline transformed her hands. She pulled, pushed, lifted until the frame loosened slightly from its hinge. The wood creaked. Her heart pounded so loudly it seemed everyone could hear. And when she managed to move the picture about 10 centimeters, the air trapped behind it escaped in a dry, cold breath. And then she saw it, the child's eye. A desperate eye, marked with dried tears, looking at her with a mixture of fear and hope. The weak voice repeated, "I'm thirsty." She almost fell backward. Panic gripped her entire body as she tried to move the picture further, praying it wasn't too late. But before she could continue, a shadow fell on the floor. The stepmother appeared, her face icy, her lips tense and her voice firm, saying, "What do you think you're doing?" The maid glared at her, suddenly understanding every detail, every silence, every absence. The stepmother tried to advance, but the maid placed her body between her and the painting. The living room, until then filled with luxury and refined music, transformed into the stage for a monstrous secret. The child tried to speak again, but could only manage a weak moan. The maid looked around, searching for help, but at that moment, everything seemed to happen in slow motion, as if the world were about to discover the truth hidden behind a gilded frame. And it was there, in that second, that the perfect party began to crumble. The hall remained immersed in elegant music, the sophisticated laughter of the guests, and the clinking of crystal glasses, completely oblivious to the silent chaos unfolding in the next room. The maid felt her heart pounding in her chest so intensely it seemed to vibrate against the walls. The child inside the hole tried, with an almost non-existent voice, to repeat words that barely came out, and each failed attempt made the maid's throat burn with despair. It was impossible to imagine how many hours, how many days that little girl had spent in there, trapped between cold bricks, without water, without food, without anyone listening to her, while the house filled with luxury and festivities. The stepmother maintained an upright posture, trying to contain the panic that was beginning to appear in her eyes. The control she thought she had was slipping through her fingers. And in that second, the maid was certain of one thing. If she didn't do something quickly, that child might not survive. The waitress took a deep breath, mustered her courage, and raised her voice, completely ignoring the intimidating presence of the stepmother. She called the girl's first name, almost in a muffled scream, and the response was too weak to be called a response. It was such a short sound that only someone inches from the wall could hear it. The stepmother tried to downplay the situation, saying that the maid was confusing sounds from the house's structure, that it was impossible for anyone to be there. But the maid didn't back down. On the contrary, she took 2 firm steps and pulled the picture even further, exposing the narrow opening where the girl's dirty little face was now fully visible. Her eyes were fused with fear, hunger, and extreme exhaustion, and the silence that formed between the 2 adults became so heavy that it seemed to fill the air with a cutting tension. The stepmother realized there was no way to deny it anymore. She tried to change her strategy. She approached the maid and whispered in a tone as venomous as it was sweet that it was none of her business, that the girl had done it to herself, that she was strange, that she liked to play in forbidden places. But the maid knew it was a lie. She knew it from the child's gaze. She knew it from the extreme weakness of her cowering little body. And then it happened. A curious waiter heard a movement and appeared at the door. A second later, another employee approached, drawn by the visible tension. The stepmother realized she was losing control of the narrative and uttered a desperate phrase, trying to diffuse the situation. "It's just a misunderstanding. She was just playing." But the waiter looked at the hole, then at the stepmother's face, and sensed the strangeness of the scene. In a short time, 2 curious guests appeared beside them, followed by more people, until the room began to fill with perplexed stares. The elegant and controlled atmosphere of the party began to crumble as the whisper spread like wildfire. "There's a child stuck in the wall." The stepmother tried to maintain composure, but her breathing quickened. The maid, on the other hand, took the lead, not with authority, but with human urgency. She asked for water, for a flashlight, for help removing the frame without hurting the child, and the shocked guests began to cooperate. The girl's father hadn't yet arrived, too busy talking to businessmen in the garden, but the truth was about to catch up with him. The frame was finally completely removed, revealing the deep, narrow hole, a kind of old compartment in the mansion's structure, originally used to hide electrical cables, but now cruelly used as a hiding place. The girl tried to move her hands, but she was too weak. The maid carefully held her arms and tried to pull her out without causing pain. The child sobbed, begging for water in a whisper. It was at that moment that the millionaire entered. He arrived because someone had called him, saying there was a problem with the maid in the living room. He had no idea what he would find. As he approached, he saw the commotion, people murmuring, some holding their hands to their mouths in shock. And then his eyes landed on the hole, on his daughter hidden inside the wall, his face instantly transformed. First disbelief, then terror, then a pain so deep that his hands trembled. He ran there, pushing aside anyone in his path. When he saw the child in that state, dirty, dehydrated, weak, his world shattered. My God, daughter." His voice came out broken, almost breathless. He tried to pick her up, but the maid asked him to wait. She needed to be careful not to hurt the little one even more. Seeing the millionaire's devastating look, the stepmother tried to rush to him, put her hand on his shoulder, invent some absurd explanation before he could put the pieces together, but he pushed her hand away with a brusque movement that silenced the entire room. He finally realized, that none of it made sense, that the story about the excursion was false, that the girl could never have entered there alone. He stared at his stepmother, and tears began to stream down his face. He trembled, and his breath seemed to choke him. The stepmother tried to say that the maid was making it up, that the girl was hiding, that it was a joke, but the girl, still weak, shook her head slowly, saying no with a minimal but visible movement. And that small gesture destroyed any defense the stepmother had. The millionaire knelt down, placing his face close to his daughter's, apologizing repeatedly as if each apology tore a piece of him away. The maid finally managed to pull the girl out, wrapping her in her arms with the utmost care. The child's body was cold, and her breathing was irregular. She trembled, clinging to the maid's shirt as if she were the only safe person in the world. And at that moment, she was. Meanwhile, the guests watched in absolute silence. The stepmother, realizing that there wasn't a single soul there willing to defend her, began to retreat, searching for a way out, trying to escape the weight of the truth that was crashing down on her like an avalanche. The living room had transformed into an impromptu courtroom where every glance was a silent sentence. And when the millionaire finally stood up with his daughter in his arms, the girl still too weak to speak, he looked directly at his stepmother with a pain so raw and so profound that it impacted even the guests who had nothing to do with it. The waitress stood beside him, holding the water bottle someone had brought ready to help. The stepmother tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come out. He tried to invent, justify, manipulate, but nothing would work now. The truth was there in plain sight, exposed not only on the open wall, but in the child's state. And at that moment, the millionaire took the first step towards his stepmother. It wasn't anger that guided that movement. It was the pain of a father discovering he had entrusted what he held most precious to the wrong person. And the room, once full of light and wealth, was now filled with a heavy silence, about to witness the definitive shattering of that brilliant lie. The entire room seemed suspended in time when the millionaire took that first step toward his stepmother. And the tension that filled the air was so heavy, it felt like it was pressing down on the air inside everyone's lungs. He didn't shout, he didn't lunge forward, he didn't lose control, but his expression carried something far more devastating than any explosion. It was the look of a father who realized he had failed precisely where he should have been most attentive, that he had left his own daughter in the hands of someone who silently hated her. The stepmother recoiled at each of his steps, stumbling on her own heels, trembling as if facing a sentence already written. The maid, holding the water bottle, remained close to the child, who clung to her father's lap so tightly that she seemed afraid that, if she let go, she would be dragged back into the darkness of that hole that had almost taken her life. The guests dared not utter a sound. All of them, previously hypnotized by the glitz of the party, now seemed to finally see clearly the abyss behind that perfect family the stepmother was trying to sell. The millionaire stopped just inches from the woman he swore he loved, the one he believed to be the balance of the house. But now all he could see was the face of someone who represented pain, cruelty, and contempt for his daughter. He tried to speak, tried to find words to explain the monstrosity she had committed, but nothing made sense. His voice came out low, almost trembling, asking, "Why?" The stepmother tried to speak, but the maid noticed immediately, from a distance, the movement of her eyes searching for a story to invent, a justification that would sound convincing. But there was no more room for lies there. The father repeated the question, but now with more intensity, with more pain. And the stepmother mumbled something about the child being difficult, about not wanting to obey, about always ruining everything. That hit the millionaire like a direct blow to the chest. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Anger tried to rise, but he pressed his daughter against his chest, breathing heavily, trying not to lose control in front of so many people. The waitress, her voice trembling but firm, decided to speak. He explained that he had noticed signs for weeks. He said the girl was afraid to be alone with her stepmother, but had never had the courage to tell her father. He recounted the insults he had heard, the times he had found the girl crying silently, the excuses she made up to justify the emotional scars she carried. The millionaire listened to everything, his face increasingly consumed by guilt. He looked at his daughter, who was now taking small sips of water and trying to breathe better, and each detail made it clearer that this was not an accident, not an isolated act. It was premeditated, coldly planned malice. And the most painful thing was realizing that his own trust was part of it. He believed the stepmother, believed the story of the field trip, believed the girl was all right, while she was locked in the wall of her own house, hidden behind a painting that symbolized luxury, but now only represented horror. The stepmother, realizing her image was irreversibly destroyed, tried one last trick. She invented a story that the girl had hidden herself to get attention, that she, as a stepmother, had only prevented a scandal. but the girl only had to slowly shake her head and grip her father's shoulder even tighter, for no one there to believe a single word. The truth was etched in the child's physical state, without water for days, weak, with deep, dark circles under her eyes, her skin too pale. This wasn't a child's game. It was an attempt at erasure. The millionaire, finally overcome by the internal explosion he had been holding back, raised his face and said in a firm and devastating voice, "You tried to take my daughter away from me." The stepmother paled completely. He then called the mansion's security, without shouting, without a scene, only with the cold and painful authority of someone who had discovered the truth too late. 2 security guards approached, and the stepmother was taken out of the room, protesting, trying to appear a victim, but completely ignored by everyone. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The millionaire, with his still weak daughter in his arms, looked around and noticed how many eyes were watching him, but it didn't matter. All he wanted at that moment was to ensure his daughter was alive, safe, and free from any pain. He turned to the maid, and his eyes, still full of tears, met hers, a look of deep, honest, almost desperate gratitude. "If it weren't for you," he tried to say, but his voice failed him. The maid, with humility and emotion, replied that she had only done what needed to be done, that anyone with a heart would have done the same. But she knew that wasn't true. Knowing how to hear a muffled cry within a wall in the middle of a lavish party wasn't something just anyone would notice. It was sensitivity, it was courage, it was the human instinct to protect. The millionaire asked for a doctor to be called immediately, and some guests rushed to help. The girl was taken to her room, wrapped in soft blankets, and the maid stayed by her side the whole time, holding her hand, helping her drink water little by little, talking softly to calm the fear that still trembled in the child's body. The father sat beside the bed, holding his daughter's legs, as if he feared she would disappear again. He wept silently, repeatedly apologizing, asking forgiveness for not having seen it sooner, for not having noticed the signs, for having trusted the wrong person. The girl, still weak, simply rested her face against his chest, accepting the warmth of the embrace she had missed so much. Meanwhile, downstairs, the party was already over. The guests left in silence, as if they had been driven out by a truth no one expected to see. The living room, now empty, still had the exposed hole in the wall, a cruel reminder of what had happened there. The waitress went downstairs for a moment, looking at that dark space, and felt a deep chill. That house would never be the same again. The lie had been uprooted. The millionaire, after ensuring his daughter was being cared for, returned to the maid. He called her by name, with a respect he had never shown so strongly before. He thanked her for saving his daughter, for hearing the cry that no one else heard, for having the courage to confront the stepmother even without knowing what would happen next. And then, with a firm and emotional voice, he said something that would change the maid's life forever. That she would never again be treated as invisible in that house, that her courage would never be forgotten, and that, from then on, the girl's life and his would not be rebuilt without her. The maid felt tears welling up in her eyes, not out of gratitude, but because finally, that child would have a real chance to live in peace. Outside, the sound of a car taking the stepmother away echoed in the silent night. And at that moment, in that enormous mansion that held secrets within its walls, a new story began. Not one of luxury or appearances, but of healing, truth, and reconstruction. The golden painting had fallen, and with it fell the mask that hid the evil. Now only the truth remained, and the strength of those who had the courage to hear it. And if this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone you love. Click Click now to share it. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories we're preparing with great care for you.